Hello, Dr. Lay. How are you today? I'm so glad to see you again. Thank you for joining me on this Zoom meeting. And how is everything?
Yeah, I'm in Vancouver, BC. Things are good. Thank you very much.
Okay. So, yes, I was just mentioning to you that I tracked down a copy of your dissertation, which was published by the American geographers back in 1974. So I have a vintage copy of that. And I was just asking you briefly, and I think it's good that maybe if I do post this, that viewers could hear how do you so the dissertation is the Black Inner City as Frontier Outpost, and can you just describe to us a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. Well, it is a study of a neighborhood in North Philadelphia in I think around 1970, and it's really I lived there for 8 months and had continuing contacts there for some years around that. Um, it was a study of how people manage to live and get by in highly stressful environments. And there were many stresses in that neighborhood, one of which was a quite active gang scene, which of course flared up from time to time. And that's how I actually got into an interest in graffiti, was by noticing the spatial pattern of gang graffiti around the neighborhood.
Yes.
And then with my colleague Roman, who was a co-author of the piece that you're interested in, we that led us then to think about what we called the graffiti kings, and also graffiti at black-white boundaries in another neighborhood in Philadelphia, Territorial graffiti. So it was this project, which was broader than simply looking at graffiti. I think there's maybe just one or two figures in the dissertation on that. But it was fascinating. I lived there. I worked with a neighborhood organization there. I worked with a group of young people at a neighborhood church. So you know,
Do you remember the name of the neighborhood?
well, that has forever been a secret.
It was
Because
bordering Fairmont, right? That's where Dr.
no, it's
Sagruski.
not.
Oh,
It's not
okay.
bordering Fairmont. Um, it's I call it Monroe in the book, and the reason the place is the name is disguised is because I didn't want any individuals to be
Oh,
identified.
yes. Okay. Okay. So in a general scope of things, would you say West Philadelphia, North Philadelphia?
Oh, North Philadelphia,
Okay.
but that's a big area.
Yes, yes. Well, I tell you, the study that we are talking about, that the two of you combined it on, that was urban graffiti as territorial markers. And the Annals of the Association of American Geographers printed that in volume 64, number 4, December 1974. And that was from pages 491 to 505. And I found it very interesting. And I just want to say, I love that you call them the graffiti kings. And I think because of how early it was that you were reporting on this, it's fascinating. And I my thing, as when you asked me what is the point of my research, and I told you I was focused more on origin points
Mm.
for not necessarily the gang graffiti, but I do have interest in that as well. But for what you referred to as the lone graffitiist and the graffiti kings. So let me ask you this, because I think people will have interest in this, and I will not know unless I ask you, but I think I know the answer. So the the reason for your study was not exactly to find out the origin points. You reported on New York and you also reported on Philadelphia, but you weren't focused on the origin points of where it started. Am I correct?
That is correct. Uh, of course, graffiti itself is as old as human civilization.
Yes.
And I did come across a 19th century reference to graffiti. I think it was the 1840s. It's in the article anyway. Um, in Philadelphia.
Oh, yes. Yes, I know
The
that
comment
article.
that was made there is it was in the paper. I don't know if it was the Inquirer. I don't know if the Inquirer existed then, but there was a comment made that said, "We are sorry to state that this graffiti is distinctively written by Anglo-Saxon boys."
Right. I think, and there's another one too from early in 1847 in Philadelphia where it talks about the Irish gangs in
Yes,
South Philadelphia and how they used everything from house paint to charcoal to mark their territories. And
yes.
I don't think that tradition stopped all the way up until the point that you come across it in the 1970s. And
I suspect you're quite correct there.
right, just the actual what your study is. Urban graffiti is territorial markers. And now you did share with me on another Zoom, but I just want to let the folks know again. So you came over from Wales to pursue your education in America, and what university was that?
I was at Penn State at Central Pennsylvania.
Okay, yes. And now, so also your associate, and I want to make sure I'm getting this name correct, Dr. Cybruski?
Yeah, Zabriskie. Yeah,
Zabruski. Okay. He was located in Philadelphia as well, doing a similar project, his dissertation, and he was in Fairmont, which was a predominantly white neighborhood. And he was studying the third type of graffiti, which you pointed out to me last time, which was kind of racially oriented. Uh, Definitely not something I appreciate, but it's out there and it has to be reported on. And I think I've read his dissertation as well. The both of you did fine jobs with it. And I was just asking you right before we got on how you thought your dissertation might hold up in today's world, 2025.
yeah. Well, what I think, of course, I haven't read it for some time now, but what I would think is that the actual recording, observation, interpretation of everyday life in North Philadelphia in 1970 holds up quite well. But there's some rather how can I put it, Baroque scaffolding around the thesis,
Okay.
a kind of conceptual framework, which I think has aged substantially. So I think the content has aged well, but kind of just have a little snigger and move on if the conceptual framework sort of gets in the way.
Right. And as I did mention, I found that on the internet. I did purchase a copy. So one thing I really wanted to know, you have just now answered the question that you were not involved in trying to track the origin points, but you did also report on New York City. And the reason why this study crosses my path is because over the years, between Philadelphia and New York City, which both have starting points with the graffiti kings, in the 1960s, New York, a little bit before Philadelphia, a lot of people who wanted to do pieces and books and documentaries on the two cities were looking for origin points. And throughout the years, it's kind of put it into a competitive kind of framework that sometimes I wonder where folks are getting some of what they wrote, because when I read your piece, you did not give anybody credit as far as who began or who was the graffiti capital. So I think when people read, for example, there's a book, Graffiti Kings, by a gentleman named Jack Stewart, and he cites your piece. And he also adds, though, and titles his chapter, "It All Started in Philadelphia." But I can't be sure how he would ever have known that, because that's not anything that's written in your study. You know what I mean? So it starts to have these extra pieces added on, wherein it actually had about 2 to 3 extra pieces added on. They continue to cite your work, though, but those other pieces that are not in quotation marks, it's a little bit of fluff added to it. And that's why those quotation marks are very, very important when you're citing somebody's work.
That's
so
right.
what do you think about that, that some things might have been added on?
Well, your project and what you said the last few minutes is interested in origins, and that is in time. Our study was concerned with space rather than time.
Yes.
It was concerned with the geographical distribution of certain markings in public places, and the spatiality or the territoriality of that was really our key focus. So our key focus, in a nutshell, was geography, not history. It was with current distributions rather than looking at it through time.
And this is why it's also very important that I track through all of this. And believe me, these books are still coming out, because these Graffiti Kings, the ones from New York at least, ended up putting these masterpieces on the sides of the subway cars, as we talked last time. And that brought attention around the world. And they eventually made it to galleries. And some of these individuals are still selling their artwork today for thousands and thousands of dollars. So I do have to admit, as a New Yorker, when I was reading through these books and I saw the citation, and I have to read Urban Graffiti as Territorial Markers, because I thought for sure it was going to have this opinion stated of where you thought it started. And that was not the case at all. And this is why it's very important to go to the source. Would you agree?
Absolutely. You've got to do that, because, yes, when you write something, you lose control of it, and other people can manage it for their own purposes. So you do have to go to the source.
Yes. And there was one comment that you made I did ask you about. I'm not sure if you got a chance to read your actual study. I sent you the PDF of Urban Graffiti as Territorial Markers. I know that you did read some of the other stuff, but I asked you about the one line. You said graffiti are even more prevalent in Philadelphia, which makes a rather abashed claim to be the graffiti capital of the world. And I asked you about the word abashed. And did you think that it was embarrassing that the officials in Philadelphia would say that? Or do you think it was embarrassing to be the actual graffiti capital? Did you get a chance to think about that at all?
Yeah, I did. And I think it's the second of the two options that you presented, because that was the view of, if you like, public institutions in Philadelphia. That was not necessarily the popular view. I don't know what the popular view was, but certainly politicians and key figures in the city regarded graffiti as a nuisance, which had to be cleaned up, and tax dollars had to be spent on cleaning it up.
Yes, and it's very interesting. You're the second Zoom meeting that I've had today, and I just got off of one with a gentleman by the name of Bob Rivera, who was the one that put the alternative graffiti workshop into motion. And
Right.
he said the same thing, that Frank Rizzo, who was the mayor at that point, was very harsh on these teenagers and viewed them as basically adult criminals. And they didn't want to know about any alternative programs for them. But at the same time, programs were being taken out of their communities. So even though it was somewhat of a popularity contest, it also was a cry out. And a lot of the wall riders from that time period tell me they say those same two things. Of course, it was some popularity involved in it, but we were looking to stay away from the gangs that you also studied. And it was very real in Philadelphia, what they called the gang war boys. And these guys would get in the streets with chains and sticks and hundreds. New York went through stuff like this as well, but New York and Philadelphia were having very big problems with these gangs at that time period,
Absolutely. Yeah, that does feature in my thesis more, the gang problem.
Right. And again, we just went through the history of how long we're finding those territorial markers in Philadelphia, and as well as New York City, which probably we hear reports coming out of New York as far back as 1820 in the 5 Points district, which, wow, folks in that time period were living under horrific conditions in some of those first tenement buildings that were built up, and people were literally living on top of each other, and there wasn't proper sewage treatment. And, I'm just sure it was a space where these gangs could have taken advantage, and they did mark their territory as far back as the early 1800s.
Yeah, I'm sure that's quite correct, and that would tie up with that point from the Philly paper in the 1840s, which was identifying the gang graffiti too.
Yes, and in that very same paragraph, it says here, Mayor Rizzo's platform in the 1971 mayoral election, and early in 1972, legislation was introduced into the city council to control the sale of spray paint cans. So they literally wanted to control who was able to purchase this spray paint. I guess it would have been to the point where you would have had to have shown ID or something like that you were of age. And I'll tell you, though, most of those teenagers were stealing the spray paint. So I don't know how much that would have helped keep it out of their hands. But they were trying these things. They were trying a lot of things. I think the gentleman that I just got off the Zoom with, Mr. Rivera, I think he was more on the right point of providing them with other opportunities and showing them that if you have this artistic strain, why don't we try to see what we can do with that and give some opportunities to see, what some painting might do, or, maybe you want to get into architecture or signage. There's so many different opportunities out there. And I think they might not have taken, that is Rizzo, he might not have taken the right approach. And also, just to be fair, maybe they didn't know what to do, because that always could be, something that we think we're doing the right thing by coming down hard. I don't think that was the right thing, considering the fact that you have to notice this is somewhat of a cry out. Would you agree with that at all?
Well, mentioning Frank Rizzo's name, that is really a blast from the past, isn't it? He, as I recall, was a former Philadelphia cop.
Yes.
And was a very strong law and order guy. I mean, he was a pretty tough cookie, and I think he didn't get much beyond the frame of, the term you used, young criminals or adult criminals. he did not have a mind that there were other alternatives here, that there could be a skill that could be directed in more not only constructive ways, but also in a career developing way. I don't think that was on his agenda.
Yes, I definitely would have to agree with you on that. And now so through my research, when I finally did get to your study, I found it very interesting. And then, of course, very interesting to find out that these claims were not made by you. So I see that people added some of their own little flavor into the mix. But I was really thrown back by your study. I really enjoyed it. You went to great degrees. I think it's a great piece of work. And as I mentioned, I I build a research library as I go along. And that's why your book has made it into my research library, as well as the article, which once again, urban graffiti as territorial markers. And I build this library so that when it makes it into certain museums, the library can go along with it, because it's very important to be able to trace each study, see if there's any differences that pop up. And obviously, we're finding many, many differences here. But you also did report on New York City, and it was TAKI 183. Do you remember that name at all? His article from the New York Times?
Yes, I remember that name.
TAKI spawns pen pals. July 21st, 1971, from the New York Times. They looked for months to try to track TAKI down. They eventually found him. He liked his anonymity, so he did not allow them to take a picture. And when Channel 2 News showed up and came knocking, he kept his head turned from the camera. But what's happening with TAKI is it's the places that he went to write his name were out of the neighborhood. And he wrote on the Upper East Side. He wrote as a delivery boy, he wrote everywhere he could. And reporters and people who might not have been paying attention to these things picked up on it and said, boy, every subway station I go into, every lamppost, TAKI 183, what is this? And then eventually people found out that it was his nickname along with his street number. And they took months. They finally tracked him down to a neighborhood named the Washington Heights, which is up at the very tip of Manhattan on 183rd Street between Amsterdam Avenue and Audubon. And all the kids were out because he was already very popular. And they're screaming, he's the king. He's the king. And that's why I got such a kick out of it. Quite frankly, to hear a college professor say the graffiti kings, but from such a long time ago, I think that was awesome. You put a smile on my face that day. And I also want to say thank you so much the last time we spoke, because I saw how when I was asking you questions, for example, the magazine Philly Talk, and you instantly picked your pen up and you started taking notes. And I said, this is my kind of guy. So I really want to thank you for that, because I felt that you took it serious, and I appreciate that. And I just want to let you know, as far as anybody else who might be viewing this, there are several people now who are in their 80s, who are all college professors. There's about 5 individuals that I've spoke to that meet that criteria. So I am definitely taking this serious, and I want to tell you that I've found the origin points, and I think that I sent the study to you. Were you familiar with the name Herbert Cole?
I was. In fact, at one time I had a little book he wrote called, I think it was 36 Children.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, he was a New York teacher, as I recall, and anyway, I read the article on him where he's talking about graffiti and understanding graffiti through a young man that he helped to learn to read. So yeah, I knew the name.
Yes, that was Johnny Rodriguez, a young
Mhm.
Puerto Rican boy who lived on the Upper West Side of Manhattan. And Mr. Cole was the school teacher for his friends. And they figured if he taught us how to read, maybe they can teach Johnny. And that's how he started to notice that he would walk far from Johnny's neighborhood and far from his neighborhood, and he noticed that Johnny was on the wall very far away from his neighborhood, and it started to spark his interest.
Mhm.
And he picked up on this, and overall I think as well his study is also awesome. I think that he got a lot out of his reading the walls. He literally, like you would have had to have done as well, is go out and read the walls. Am I correct?
Yes, that's absolutely correct. You just got to pound the pavements and a bit of driving as well to see where these graffiti show up.
Yes. Now, for me, I'm born in 1970. The elementary school that I went to, PS 13 in the borough of Queens here in New York, that
Mhm.
school was built in 1931. And when
Mhm.
I finally arrived in that school, it was old wooden desks that even still had a hole for the ink
The
blot.
inkwell.
Yes, the
Yep.
inkwell. And I have to tell you, my mind wandered in class at times because of the carvings that were on these desks. And
Mhm.
I initially didn't think I was going to do it, but then the next thing I know, I'm scrawling my initials in these desks. And then in my the building that I grew up in, we had old elevators, and the insides of the elevators were wooden. And when I first moved there in 1977, just like in the school, I was seeing carvings from as far back in the apartment complex that went back to the 50s. But in that particular public school, there were carvings on that desk from 1934. Excuse me,
Wow.
not on the desk, in a section of the school,
Mm.
be in the auditorium where there was plays put on in the stage area, where there were literally carvings from back in 1934. And that blew my mind. And then in my junior high school, which was built in 1953, yes, in the same area, in the auditorium, on the wood, there were now markers being utilized. And, Joey was here 1956, obviously following suit with Kilroy. You know what I mean?
Yep. Yep. Mm.
And then the oldest of all of the schools, Jamaica High School, which was the largest high school in the nation at one point. It still is the largest high school in New York City, but unfortunately, due to violence, they had to close the doors and they use it for other things now. But in that school, built in 1924 up in the bell tower, I was seeing again carvings from as far back as 1932. So you are correct. This is nothing new. And I'm just
And
so,
David, just to interrupt you there, the
yes,
interesting thing is that that would have been entirely different ethno-racial groups at that time.
uh, you mean in those districts?
In those districts in the 1930s, because of course the American city has seen successive waves of migrants who have come
Yes,
in,
yes,
and if we go back to the neighborhood, for example, that I worked in North Philadelphia had been a German neighborhood, and but it changed, and no doubt before it was German, it was something else as well. So what you're seeing there are probably inscriptions from white ethnic groups of that period.
yes, yes. In 1924, it was Caucasian kids going to that school. I'm Caucasian. When I went to Jamaica High School in the 1980s, though, You're correct. The school was now predominantly Black American kids.
Yeah.
So also we were using markers and spray paints. I have to confess, I might not have been a king, but I dabbled. And by the time I'm getting into it, it was kind of like a sport with teenagers.
Yeah.
It had become somewhat of a popularity contest where it had reached places where maybe they weren't having problems financially or economically, but even sons of doctors and lawyers were now wanting to see their names on trains and on popular areas like Times Square and so forth. So
Mm-hmm.
I'm so glad that we were able to talk for a little while about this and that you were able to inform me that you definitely were not involved in the origin points. But what we see with Herbert Cole's study, he actually is able to pinpoint years. And when we matched that up to the teenagers from Philadelphia, it's interesting to see that it takes this turn where Jack Stewart decides to name the title of that chapter. It all started in Philadelphia. So, this is for my work now, for me to hash this out and square this out. And one thing that goes along with the New York theme is that the teenagers in Philadelphia did not move on to doing what we called the masterpieces. In other words, they stayed with the independent tag, just the signature on the wall. They might have placed a crown, they might have put a peace sign, but they didn't put these masterpieces on the sides of the trains. And that's what went around the world. So it's the graffiti scene from New York City that actually took it around the world. And I'll go as far as to say that it wasn't TAKI's generation. So in 1971, when these articles come out in New York and in Philadelphia, it didn't spread at that point. It would be the next generation that put these larger pieces on. And then by the 1980s, galleries from all around the world were eating it up. So it wasn't the signatures, but they're the ones that influenced the kids that would come after them. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So is there anything else? Because we're going to wind this down. There's not much time left on this one. Is there anything else that sticks out about Herbert Cole's study that you might
Yes.
think?
Well, something that he reminded me of was the way in which people would add titles to their names, like Doctor Cool #1. And the most spectacular example of that, I remember from the neighborhood in North Philadelphia where I was working, was a graffiti artist who called himself, wait for this, Baron Erich von Schwenk.
Yeah, yes. There was also there was also a Sherlock Holmes, I believe, and
yes, there was with a hat.
That's great. That's great. Yeah. That is funny. Could you say the name one more time?
Baron Erich von Schwenk.
I don't think as far as a wall writing moniker, I don't know if there's one as classy as that one. But Dr. Cool #1, actually, I spoke to that gentleman within the past 12 months. And I'd have to say it's not a street number. He's possibly the first one that put that #1 behind his signature, and he was and is a cool dude. Like I said, I have spoken with him recently, and it's just real incredible. All of this stuff coming. It's after 50 years, but the reason why it's still so pertinent is because 50 years later, from those masterpieces on the train, street art developed. And we have artists like Jean-Michel Basquiat, whose painting sold in 2017 for $110 million, Yeah. And And here's a guy who started writing phrases with a spray paint can down in Tribeca and in, Soho, down below Houston Street, where a lot of artists were gathering in New York. And he would strategically place these sayings, and he wanted this attention brought to him, sort of the way TAKI 183 knew, hey, if I want my name out there, I should put this where the right people see it who might report on this,
Mm-hmm.
And it's pretty incredible stuff. Now, it does start as vandalism, of course, but to know that there were alternatives that some of these teenagers took, and to think that some of these guys have gone on to be some of the most popular artists of our time, it's just really interesting for me. So once again, it seems like it's winding down. I don't want you to get cut off. Thank you so much for spending the time with me. And I don't know, maybe if something might pop up, if I shoot you an email and maybe we talk again for 20 minutes, but I think that you really helped me so much. And I want to thank you, Dr. Ley. Okay, sir?
Okay, well, thank you. And I do wish you well with your project. It's a great project.
Thank you so much. And when the museum opens up, I'll shoot you an email. And thank you so much, sir. And you have a good day, okay?
Okay, then. Bye-bye.